You're listening to Coaching Cues podcast, where experts all around the world answer your most burning questions surrounding the wide topic of strength training. Every week, we tackle the what, the why, and the how of one specific topic in just 15 minutes. Straight to the point, no fluff. So, without further ado, let's get straight into this week's episode.
What's up, everyone? My name's Dr. Jake Lenarden, and I'm a research fellow at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm an eating disorder researcher with particular interest in understanding the treatment and prevention of eating disorders using technology. I'm currently serving on the editorial board for 3 leading academic journals in the field. I'm the founder of Break Binge Eating, and I've published around 60 peer-reviewed scientific papers on eating disorders to date. Recently, Expertscape rated me in the top 1% of eating disorder researchers globally over the past 10 years. And in this episode of the podcast, I want to talk about the relationship between fitness and physique sports and eating disorders. We know that physique competitors and a bunch of different fitness sports are strongly associated with eating disorders. But that's not to say that everyone who goes on to develop or to engage in these types of sports go on to develop an eating disorder. There are various factors that relate or moderate these associations here, which are coming into light at the moment as we further understand this topic. But just as a primer, I think it's important to reiterate the epidemiology of these classes of individuals. So some studies, for instance, have shown rates of eating disorders among physique competitors to be as high as 25 to 30%. There are even many more people who engage in disordered eating behaviours who don't quite meet the diagnostic criteria for eating disorder, but nevertheless are impaired psychologically, socially, and even physically as well. So I guess the next question is, well, why are these related? Why do people who engage in fitness or physique sports more prone to developing eating disorders than people who don't? Well, I think it has to do with the methods used to achieve the goals that people are setting themselves. So, for example, fitness and physique sport competitors rely heavily on dietary practices to meet or achieve their particular goals at play. Now, dieting in and of itself is not harmful. It only becomes harmful when it's practiced in a certain way. And that is when the diet is highly rigid, restrictive, and extreme. By this, I mean that it's composed of multiple distinct and demanding food rules that govern eating behavior. So things like skipping meals entirely, fasting for very long periods of time, avoiding certain foods or food groups out of fear of weight or fat gain. These types of diets are particularly problematic in the context of eating disorders through a bunch of different mechanisms. So one mechanism is that hunger and physiological processes usually get in the way and cause bouts of binge eating. Another process is called the abstinence violation effect. That's when someone holds these really rigid standards about their eating and their dieting, more often than not, people are prone to break these sorts of diet rules. So for instance, how long can someone go without eating carbohydrates? Or how long can someone go without eating after 6 p.m? People are usually prone to break these diet rules that they hold. And when they break these diet rules, what usually happens is that people interpret that as a catastrophic failure in self-control. And the consequence of that is they allow themselves, or they give themselves permission to engage in various disordered eating behaviors like binge eating, because they say to themselves that they will start or recommence the rigid diet on the next day. The final mechanism that links extreme diets to disordered eating is via the disinhibition effect. That's because dieting usually takes up a lot of cognitive resources, particularly dieting that is extreme and that is rigid. We only have a finite amount of cognitive resources, and there are oftentimes stimuli try to compete for those different resources. So for instance, when you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, that competes for the same resources that the dieting is trying to compete for. Because those stimuli are so powerful, they end up taking over the space that the dieting behavior or psychological processes are trying to use. And this is why it's not uncommon for people to engage in disordered eating behaviors when they're under the influence or when they've experienced abrupt changes in negative mood states that also compete for those same resources. So what we usually recommend, or what has far less evidence linking dieting to disordered eating practices, is a more flexible or a graded approach to dieting. That's when people still pay attention to what they're eating, or they still restrain their eating to some extent, but they're not doing it in such a rigid way. They're more flexible, relaxed, and inclusive with all the foods that they allow themselves to eat. There's actually evidence showing that a flexible approach to dieting is actually associated with lower levels of disordered eating patterns. But I will note that the evidence is quite poor on flexible dieting and disordered eating, composed mainly of cross-sectional evidence, meaning that it's impossible to disentangle cause and effect. This is why we need randomized control trials to prescribe flexible dieting approaches to see if it's causally related to a reduction in disordered eating. Unfortunately, none have been conducted as of yet, but it's definitely a fruitful area of research to come. Another method physique and sports competitors use is calorie tracking. So that's using MyFitnessPal or any other calorie tracking device to monitor their intake, their dietary intake. Now, calorie tracking isn't inherently harmful again. It depends on the underlying motives or the reasons for why someone is calorie tracking. Calorie tracking is just a surface level behavior for some deeper dieting tendencies that someone has. It's a way to monitor one's food intake. And because of that, calorie tracking isn't necessarily harmful. It depends on whether the dieting is practiced in an extreme or a flexible fashion. People who obsess over calorie tracking, who track everything to the absolute gram, who set limits that are well below what their body needs to function optimally, they're the types of people most prone to these disordered eating issues. It's not using the device per se, it is the obsessions behind using it and feeling like you need to continually use it in order to live a life. Now, what's the evidence behind calorie tracking and disordered eating? Well, the evidence is really weak, and we can't make any strong conclusions that calorie tracking can cause an eating disorder or disordered eating. I've conducted my own research on calorie tracking and disordered eating via simple cross-sectional studies. This is where I've surveyed the target population to get their perspectives on what it's like to calorie track. And we found a couple of really important findings. We found associations between calorie tracking and disordered eating, such that those who reported currently tracking their calories via an app reported higher levels of binge eating, extreme concerns with eating, diet rigidity, shape and weight concerns, and even social dysfunction compared to those who didn't report tracking their calories via an app. But interestingly, when I asked the survey participants how they felt, around 30% felt that calorie tracking app was responsible for the disordered eating issues. They believed that it came first in the cycle. Now, this doesn't overcome the limitations of cross-sectional evidence, but it provides another perspective that there are some people that may be particularly vulnerable to the effects of calorie tracking on disordered eating. We need more rigorous prospective designs that will allow us to disentangle these associations and to establish that temporal precedence. But I think from the existing research, we can safely conclude that there are a subgroup of people for whom calorie tracking may be particularly harmful. For most or the majority of individuals, I don't think we can say that it is particularly harmful. It may depend on a variety of factors based on what the evidence is suggesting. But we clearly need more work in this area. And one other important finding from my research here is that we asked about the underlying motivations for calorie tracking. So we split up people into one of two groups. Those who track their calories purely for aesthetic related reasons, so for weight control or getting a great physique, versus those who track their calories for more health reasons and disease prevention. What we found was that those who reported for aesthetic reasons reported substantially higher levels of disordered eating behaviors than those who reported for more disease prevention and health promotion. And in fact, those who reported that they were using a calorie tracking device for disease prevention reported levels of disordered eating that were basically indistinguishable from those who didn't report calorie tracking at all. So this just highlights that there are numerous variables that may be at play that determines whether calorie tracking may be harmful for someone. And it seems like the underlying motivations could be a useful starting point to explore through more rigorous prospective designs. Moving on from dieting now, another method people use to monitor their physique is body checking. Now, body checking can take a variety of different forms. It can be jumping on the scales to check your weight, looking in the mirror, feeling aspects of your body to gauge for levels of fat or muscularity or tone, and other things like taking your measurements. So again, body checking is not inherently harmful. It only becomes harmful when it's done really obsessively and to the extreme, to the point where people find themselves stepping on the scales multiple times a day. Now, there's good evidence showing that there's a linear relationship between body checking behavior and disordered eating symptoms. So that the more frequently someone checks their behavior, the higher the symptoms they have. So let's take the examples of weighing yourself on the scales. If you're obsessed with your body and you're weighing yourself multiple times a day, what usually happens is the person pays very close attention to minor natural fluctuations in their weight. So on 1 minute, they may weigh something, and then when they jump on the scales 2 hours later, they may weigh something slightly different, whether it's increased or stayed the same or decreased. Paying attention to those minor fluctuations is problematic. And it's problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that it becomes a way for users to quantify their self-worth. The scales essentially become the way in which a person judges themselves if they're paying too much attention to it. And two, the outcome of this is essentially the same. So if we jump on the scales, there are 3 outcomes that we can achieve, but the underlying or the broader outcome usually stays the same. One outcome is that weight changes, such that it either increases or decreases, and the second outcome is that it stays the same. But people who are really obsessed about their body weight and shape usually make the same conclusion after jumping the scales, and that is that they ought to diet harder and more strictly. There's strong relationships documented in the literature between body checking and dieting severity or rigidity. So people who weigh themselves, when they find out the outcome of their checking their weight, they then conclude that they ought to diet harder, because if they increase their weight, the diet didn't work previously, so they need to go harder. The same goes if they stayed the same. And if their weight decreased, that's reinforcing, and it's suggesting that they ought to keep going with what they were doing. Now, this is a problem, remember, only if it's done in a strict and extreme fashion, and it takes away aspects of the person's psychological or social functioning. Another reason why obsessive body checking is a problem is because it reinforces or it fuels extreme distortions with body image, or those more attitudinal components of body image concerns. So physique competitors or fitness athletes usually place a lot of their self-esteem or self-worth on their ability to control their weight or their shape. Now, it's not good to have too many eggs in one basket, because if that area isn't going particularly well in your life, the person will always feel bad about themselves. So what you need to do is you need to broaden your scheme of self-worth. Yes, it's okay to have your fitness and physique sport competition as one part of your self-worth sphere, but it's also important to not neglect other areas of life, because that underlying concern with body image is what usually fuels a bunch of different disordered eating behaviors in this population. So you need to avoid that as much as possible by getting much more out of life, valuing friendships, valuing education, your occupational performance, any other thing that you can think of as well. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and place all of your attention on your physique competition. Yes, it may be important, but remembering that it's not the only thing in your life may help mitigate those extreme body image disturbances we see. So then how do you deal with these problems if they exist? Well, one, as we spoke about, is being flexible in nature, not being too extreme and rigid, allowing a variety of different foods into one's diet, being continually structured with your eating, making sure that you eat consistently 3 meals a day and 3 snacks a day, so you prevent those delayed eating patterns that can contribute to various disordered eating behaviors. The second, as we talked about, was ensuring that you get more out of life, spending more time with friends, family, investing in education, all those things that provide sources of self-esteem. It's really important for tackling those extreme disturbances in body image that we see. And making sure that you don't obsessively check, reducing the frequency with which you check your body image. Knowing that it's okay to pay attention to longer term changes, not these minor day-to-day fluctuations, because they're not an accurate representation of your weight or your shape. Longer term, month by month, is more accurate and has been shown to be more psychologically healthy. So just to recap, there is a huge relationship between physique sports and eating disorders, but there are multiple variables at play. Some of them include the types of methods people use to achieve their goals or to try to achieve their goals, and they include dieting and body checking. They're both forms of self-monitoring, but there's evidence showing that it's the underlying motivations that seem to be an important variable that explains why some people develop problems in the eating disorders and why some people may not. More evidence is clearly needed, but we've got useful research questions and hypotheses to answer. And then tackling these types of disturbances can come from regular structured eating, making sure that you're flexible, and reducing the rigidity associated with these forms of self-monitoring. So taking breaks is important when you finish your physique sporting efforts. I want to end off by saying thank you for listening to this podcast. I do hope that you have developed a lot of knowledge out of it. You can find me at Break Binge Eating on Instagram or on my Break Binge Eating website. And if you're a coach, a personal trainer, or a health professional, I've recently launched my own course called Binge Eating Essentials for Health Professionals. This course will help you, as the professional, help better screen, understand, and address your clients with binge eating problems. It's a multi-modular course. You'll get a lot of interactive exercises on how you can best serve your clients who are struggling with these issues to prevent any long-term problems. Again, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you for listening to Coaching Cues podcast. If you would like your question to be answered by an expert, please head to coachingcues.org/ask. See you next week.